Okay, so we're on page Memches, where he says Lahavim Biyad Dvarim Hanal, but we really ran through the last part of the previous section where he began the answer to the question. He gave the questions that we started the maamar with, and we didn't really get to spend that much time explaining. Just to give again a brief review of the basic answer. So the questions are all based on the idea of how do we understand the statement of the Zohar, that the Zohar says Havaya and Elokim Hakul Echad, as it says in the pasuk V'yodaita Moskve, that you need to know and place upon your heart that Havaya is Elokim. So the question was, and the Zohar added not just Havaya Elokim, but Havaya and Elokim Hakul Echad. So the question was, So he developed the questions in great detail. How could we understand the idea that the Zohar is saying that Havaya and Elokim Hakul Echad, when first of all Havaya means by definition Havaya is the divine name of revelation, and Elokim is the divine name of concealment, and we spoke about that in terms of the difference between iris and kalim, lights and vessels. That when we talk about divine revelation, we talk in terms of divine lights. In the language of Kabbalah, the name Havaya is the source of the lights, and the name Elokim is the source of the vessels. The question was, again, we see that the function of the light is to reveal, the function of the vessels is to conceal, even though we said the function of the vessels is also to reveal. It's not, that's the whole point of having lights and vessels, is to reveal, but it doesn't reveal the etzem, it doesn't reveal the light as it is unto itself. It only reveals a glimmer of the light. So how is it, and he gave numerous examples along the way of lights and vessels, including in the physical vessels of the mind and the eye. So how is it that we say that Havaya and Elokim Hakul Echad? So the answer that he gave was that he said he's going to give us an answer based on Koyches HaNefesh, because B'psari Echza Lika, from my flesh I will perceive God. And he explained that the reason that is the case is because man is created in the divine image, and that's why you can look at the Nefesh Adam, and from that extrapolate, or probably more correctly interpolate some insights into the divine. So he said he's going to illustrate and explain using Koyches HaNefesh. So I'm going to use a slightly different language than what he used. We learned it inside last week. I'm going to use more. So basically, when we're talking about Koyches HaNefesh, what we're talking about is what's going on inside the person. Okay? We're talking about what goes on inside a person. It's true that a person also interacts with the world around him. That's a different conversation. What we're talking about is looking at the person, what's going on inside. So what's going on inside the person is, as we explained a while back, that there's a self. Okay? All the different faculties, all the different functions that are operating, they're not operating on their own. There's a self that is operating this kayach, that kayach, the other kayach. There's one self. It's not different selves. There's one self. That now it's using the mind, now it's using the heart, now it's using whatever. The self is the one. There is one self that's using all the different factors. So when we talk about the aspect within the self of revelation. What we mean is that there's the capacity for self-expression within yourself. We're not talking about self-expression in terms of to the outside. Self-expression within yourself would be you come up with an idea. You come up with an idea that's coming from yourself to yourself, not to anybody else. It's coming up with an idea. But now it's not the self as it is just pure self. It's the self as it's expressing itself into something, into an idea, into a feeling, into something. So we could call that actually a creative process. A creative process means something wasn't here before, and now the self is expressing itself in something new that wasn't here before. So in every creative process, he's working more specifically with the world of ideas, the world of intellect, the world of seichel. The world of seichel, you have to have not only the ability to generate ideas, along with the ability to generate ideas from the same self or the same source. Technically, he says, there's a source in between the self and the actual idea. There's a source called the koach haMoskve, the power to conceive and produce ideas, the power to engage in intellect, to produce on an intellectual level, whether you're producing ideas or producing understanding or producing insight, whatever it is, the ability for the seichel to operate, there is a level between the self and the actual ideas coming up in the mind called the koach haMoskve. But the point is that at whatever level the self is producing, is creating. So that creative source, we wouldn't say that by when it wants to express itself in some creative fashion, that it has no limit, by the way. It could create endlessly. It has, technically, if a person would live forever, the koach haMoskve, it has no specific limit on the ability. It may be limited by the physical brain that it's working with. It may be limited by the physical of time the person has on this world. But the source is a source of endless creativity. But what is it? What you wanted to produce is a very clearly defined ideas. So it has an endless capacity to produce ideas, but it also has to have the same capacity to define that idea in a very structured and limited way. So you wouldn't say that I am doing two separate processes. One is I'm being creative. Well, creative is endless. There's endless possibilities for creativity. So there's endless creativity. Then I have another power that I say, okay, first I'm going to let out some endless creativity. Then I'm going to take the structure part and I'm going to limit that endless creativity. No, it's all me. Part of my being creative, whatever the by the way, creativity again is not limited to people that use it today for like art and things like that. But that's not everything that's going on inside yourself. It could be an idea about anything. All creativity is all self-expression comes along with the ability to define it in a very limited and structured way. So in the world of intellect, that's extremely important because you have an idea, you have to be able to define it, you have to be able to categorize it, you have to be able to, where is it appropriate, where is it not appropriate, does it fit, where doesn't it fit? Otherwise, you're going to get lost. And especially when you're trying to develop an idea in its details and in its applications, you really have to be able to say, okay, it only goes this far. It doesn't go. This is where it goes. This is how it. This is where it makes sense. This is where it doesn't make sense. This is where it fits. This is where it doesn't fit. This is where it applies. This is where it doesn't apply. But the point is, you have to be able to contain it and structure it. So again, it could be in the most simple thing. You have an idea. I don't know. You feel like I really gotta get a car. I need a car. I have to have a car. You know what? I think I really want a car. Now you have to figure, okay, a car. That's that. Now you have, in your mind, you have to now say, okay, it should have this feature, that feature, it should cost this much, it should cost that. But nothing happened yet. You didn't say anything to anybody. You didn't do anything. You didn't do nothing. It's all going on inside yourself. You came up with this idea. You realized it, and now you're refining the idea and breaking it down and saying before it was just very general, and now you're getting down into particular specifics, and you're narrowing down the idea more and more. So it's not two opposing forces at work here. That it's really just two sides of the same creative process. So the way he says it is, in terms of when we talk about Atzmus Ein Sof, so he says that the source of the Shem Havai and the source of Shem Elokim in the Atzmus Ein Sof, in its source in the infinite light, is not. It's technically you could call one of a tnuah of Chesed and one a tnuah of Gevura, but they're both coming from the same source. The Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei and the Shem Elokim, they're both coming from the same source. They're both being expressed in the creative process. That's the two sides of the creative process. That's all me. So he says from the Avodas HaKodesh that that's the mitzad in of shleimus, that Shem yesh lekeach bebilti val gvul, yesh lekeach begvul. Just like he has the power in self-expression in infinite manner, he also has the power to express himself in finite. So he says that if you're going to say not, then then you're actually imposing a limit on him by saying no, that infinite, he's stuck, he's trapped in infinity, he can't get out. No, that's not that's you imposing a limit on him and saying, but that's not something that we can do. It's actually interesting that there's a long beer from the Rebbe on Sharich V'Emunah, the end of the long beer of the Rebbe, Sharich V'Emunah, the end of Perek Dalet, and in the brackets that start at the end of Perek Dalet and go through Perek Hey, where he talks about this idea that the Gevura is actually the part that holds back. It is part of the creative process. It's not. It's not just creating a limit. It's actually that itself is creativity, right? If you think of somebody wants to create a piece of music, right? So deciding the meter and the length and the notes and do you think that's cutting away from his creativity? His creativity is endless, and now he's chopping away pieces to make it fit. He's limiting his creativity. No, that's part of his creativity. How to make the pieces work. How to make that's not. And it's not something different. It's not something that's outside an outside force. And it's not a separate force. It's within his creative process. He's figuring out what fits, what doesn't fit, what's gonna create the perfect end result that he wants. So the idea is that that's as much self-expression. It's as much a part of of the self expressing its creativity, of the divine, infinite light expressing its creativity, so to speak, as pure revelation is. It's not. It's expressing. It has the power to express infinite. But it also has the power to express itself in finite forms. So that that itself is also a part of its creativity, even though in the nefesh you could give them different names. They call one chesed and one gevura because they're like two tenuas in the same creative process, but it's really all part of one process. So you said in halacha you find this idea that ein etzem master al etzem, that a thing can't cover itself up. it's because it's all part of it. It's not one thing is covering up the other thing. It's not really hiding. It's not two. Now it's not two separate things. There's the light and there's the vessel, and the vessel is covering up the light. That's because you're looking at it from a perspective. You're looking at it from the outside, and you're giving it separate names, lights and vessels. But when you look at it from the perspective of the creative process, lights and vessels are the creative energy, that the infinite creative possibility with the creative ability to put form and structure on the and come up with a creation b'gvul. So he says that in halacha you find this idea that if a person, in order to make a bracha, you have to have your head covered. So you can't cover your head with your hand to make a bracha. Why can't you cover it? Because ein etzem asra al etzem. But somebody else, if someone else will put his hand on your head for you, that's fine. There's not a problem with a hand. The problem is it can't be your hand. So why can't it be your hand? Because a thing can't cover itself up. But if you step back from the outside and you looked at it, you would say, these two are within the individual, the head and the hand are like the furthest apart in terms of, without a head, you can't exist. You lose your head, game over. Chas v'sholom, no one should know for it. It should never happen. Then it was certainly not a Jew. But if someone loses their hand, they can go on living, right? So, how different our heads and hands are so different. But there could be the difference between life and death, and yet. But from the perspective of the self, the hand is just as much part of me as my hand is just as much a part of me as my head. It's not like less a part of me. So because it's me, I can't cover me with me. Self can't cover self. So he says it comes out that there is no concealment. So now he's starting in the next section. He says, but this needs more explanation. To understand the explanation of what we said before, that they're not opposites, Havai and Elikim, but they're two different sides of Atzmus Ein Sof, whether it's the expression or containment. So he says, still, it would seem that it's not understood. The entire function of Shem Elikim is to constrict and to conceal. That's its whole purpose. Its whole function is to cover up and to conceal. That's the idea of the Shem Elikim. And in fact, it's an essential ingredient in the whole creative. It's the thing within the creative process that's going to allow for the possibility of separate existences that experience themselves as existing outside of God. So it's really its job is really to cover up and conceal. That's what it does.
Is he saying that till now the way we understood, so we understand how they could coexist. Okay, the explanation till now was that Havai and Elikim kul echad, they could coexist and they're not opposites because they're one etzem. And now what's going on, but the fact is they won't look the same.
No, he's part out, but he's saying more than that. He said not just they can coexist. They
work together. That's how they work together.
Two sides of the same
coin. But at the end of the day, they can't look the same, because at the end of the day, this is Bleakville and this is Gvul.
He's not going to change. That's not going to change in his. That's not going to change in his. In this maamar, he's not going to explore how Bleakville is because how Gvul is even more Bleakville than Bleakville is. That's not where he's going. He's not.
No, because
V'yodaita Moskve in this maamar. He's just trying to explain how even what he's trying to address is the concealment aspect. That even the concealment is ultimately not a concealment. There is no concealment. That's where he's going with this. He's not going with this that. So he says, Its entire purpose, its entire function is because ultimately the point of this whole creative process is that there should be a separate existence. At least existence that experience themselves as separate. Right? So the whole point is that the whole point is that it should conceal. Not just that it should package, but that it should conceal. Normally, when I talk about two sides of a creative process, I'm not hiding anything by leaving out, deciding what things go into my architectural plan and what things don't go into my. I'm not like hiding anything by leaving certain things out or putting the. I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm not trying to cover anything up. Here, Shem Alekim is trying to hide and is trying to cover up. That's what it's trying to do. It's there to hide and cover up. So what are you going to tell me that it doesn't hide and that's its job? Fine, you came up with a source in halacha that a hand doesn't cover its head because it's not effective at hiding. Put your hand in front of your face, past the toddler, you're not hiding from anybody, right? So it doesn't work. But here, it actually works. It does a really good job. It covers up, and that's its job. Its function is to cover up. So how are you going to tell me at the same time, no, but self can't cover up self. It's covering up, and it's not covering up at the same time. So he says, however, the matter will be understood by way of an analogy from Nefesh Adam. We find by a mashpia mekabel. A mashpia mekabel in Chassidus, as we mentioned earlier, is almost always talking about hashpa of seichel. Okay, we're talking about, and usually we're talking about the godly seichel of Chassidus, of Holocaust, things that are highly abstract concepts. Shamekabel rachik erke mehamashpia. In a case where the recipient is on a whole different level, his level is distant from that of the mashpia. So there's like the point of relativity that they can relate to each other it can only relate to the Rebbe's level of understanding on a very limited level. He can only like a great wise man, that has to be mashpia seichel to a mekabel cotton, to a small recipient who's not yet on any kind of high level. I'm saying cotton b'seichel shaloi be'erach hamashpia, that his seichel is small shaloi be'erach hamashpia. So this is the sort of the one might imagine that this is sort of like the Rebbe, in this case the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe sort of like sharing the experience of what it's like to be a Rebbe and trying to teach ideas and concepts that are that to people that have no shaykhus to the reality that the Rebbe inhabits. That's so tiny and so insignificant, and he's trying to speak to their minds. So it's sort of like maybe a tiny window into what the experience is for a Rebbe. So he says, "Hinei behechrech," it perforce. He's absolutely forced. It's not optional. It's a must. Shemashpia yitzamtzim v'yalim etzem sichlei v'chachmasei. When he says he has to constrain, and restrain, and he has to conceal the essence of his insight and wisdom that he has in that specific intellectual concept. We're not talking about forget his general wisdom and knowledge and insight. That's not something that he's not even offering. Here he's offering a specific teaching, a specific idea, but the way he gets it in his seichel, in his wisdom, the way that idea lives up in his seichel world, up in his chachma world. So he has to kick in. He has to, even within himself. We're talking about a creative process within himself. He hasn't started. Forget about. He's not there talking to anybody yet. Within himself, he has to restrain himself, and he has to sort of shut it down, cover it up. And he cannot reveal to him only what is on his level, what's appropriate for him, what he can handle. If you reveal to him the depth and breadth of his wisdom in that concept, in that specific concept that he's teaching him, the way it is by him, the expansiveness of it and the depth of it, his senses will become completely overwhelmed and confused. He will not be able to get anything. Forget about getting everything. He won't even be able to get anything because he'll be completely overwhelmed. He's so out of his depth, he'll be completely overwhelmed. He won't know what's flying. Therefore, it is a hechrich, it's essential, it's necessary. It's an absolute necessity that he should constrain and cover up the entire depth and breadth, expansiveness that he has of his wisdom in this subject. You can only reveal to him only an external glimmer from that intellectual concept, from that idea, bekitzer nimratz, in extreme brevity, with the erech hamakabel, according to the abilities and capacities of the makabel. But since we're talking about an abstract idea, it's not just enough to limit it and shorten it. It's also necessary to have malbish umalim b'mashal. He dresses it up and he covers it up with a mashal, with an analogy. The mashal is something that's entirely foreign relative to the nimshal. It's a totally different subject. He's talking about something completely different. But he's talking about a king and his subjects when he's trying to give you a mashal for a deeper abstract idea in the godly realms. Those are realities that are so far removed from each other. So it's completely foreign to the nimshal, to the analog, to the lesson. And therefore the mashal actually covers up and conceals the seichel k'mei halavush, like a garment that covers up something. The garment is something that's separate from the thing that it's covering it up. Whether it's an object like a tablecloth, it's a person, a clothing, whatever it is. But the thing that's covering is something totally separate from the thing that's being covered. So similarly, so too, the example, the metaphor, the analogy is something that is totally foreign and removed from the nimshal. It actually covers up the nimshal. So why are you trying to teach a lesson? Why do you want to cover it up with a mashal? If that's what the function of the mashal is, to cover it up. However, through this cover up, he can actually get a handle on the nimshal and understand it. Through having the analogy, that gives his mind something to grasp onto, and from that, to extrapolate back to so this is a mashal for something more abstract. Yosi mechoven el nimshul, being that the mashal that the Chacham Gadol gives is when the Chacham Gadol gives a mashal, the mashal is mechoven el nimshul. It's completely aligned with the nimshul. Like a garment that's supposed to be the right size and fit the person who's wearing it. So when the Chacham Gadol gives a mashal, he makes sure that the mashal fits exactly to the message he's trying to convey, which is one of the reasons why b'derech klal Chassidim, more so in earlier generations when Chassidim, when people who came to join were learned people already and were pretty advanced in their understanding of things, so there was a very strong hakpada to not use any mashalim that you came up with yourself. To only use a mashal that the Rebbe came up with. Because mashalim from Chassidim, how can you know that you're exactly aligned? Your understanding is not right. That it should be a mashal mechoven. And you'll see there are actually a number of maamarim from the Rebbe where you already see from the Rebbe Rashab in a few places, but where the Rebbe will explain that our whole lengthy explanations how for this detail the mashal is mechoven, and for that detail that in Chassidus itself, that the mashal that Rabbeim gave, that it's mechoven for this concept, but for that concept it's actually not exactly mechoven because. However, in our generation, since the Rebbe sort of asked that you have to bring the lessons to everybody wherever they're at, so the Rebbe still said, if you have, sort of, to say that, I wouldn't say hutra haratzua, that you could do whatever you want with it, and unfortunately, one can argue about certain things that some people do with chassidus to try to make it more accessible. But certainly they never wanted that, you have to put it, to make a point, sometimes you have to put it into terms that people can understand, but you have to always add, they never said you should make it clear when you're reviewing Isis Harav, or when you're saying something from yourself. I heard that Rabbi Yael used to say that Moshe Goraria, when he taught Chassidus, they had to work on it. He didn't even want to teach Chassidus to the Bachram, but when they slept, they finally got him to come to the yeshiva there and to learn with the Bachram in Tel Aviv. And for a while, then he didn't last that long, but he said that when he taught Chassidus, he absolutely would not change anything, like for you to understand, but he wasn't going to start telling you stories. He was only speaking the language of Chassidus. So if you were shaykh to stel sich zu and catch what he was talking about, so you said you would ask him questions, and he would